Mythical thinking has its roots in reality, but like a plant, touches the ground only at one end. It stands unmoved and flowers wantonly into the air, transmuting into unexpected and richer forms the substances it sucks from the soil. It is therefore a fruit of experience, an ornament, a proof of organic vitality, but it is no vehicle for knowledge. It cannot serve the purposes of transitive thought or action. Science, on the other hand, is constituted by those fancies which, arising like myths out of perception, retain a sensuous language, and point to further perceptions of the same kind, so that the suggestions drawn from one object perceived are only ideas of other objects similarly perceptible. A scientific hypothesis is one which represents something continuous with the observed facts, and conceivably existent in the same medium. Science is a bridge touching experience at both ends, over which practical thought may travel from act to act, from perception to perception. Were mythology merely a poetic substitute for natural science, the advance of science would sufficiently dispose of it. What remained over would, like the myths in Plato, be at least better than a total silence on a subject that interests us and makes us think, although we have no means of testing our thoughts in regard to it. But the chief source of perplexity and confusion in mythology is kinship with moral truth. The myth, which originally was but a symbol for facts, becomes in the sequel an idol substituted for ideal values. The complication from which half the troubles of philosophy arise deserves our careful attention. European history has now come twice upon the dissolution of mythologies, first among the Stoics, and then among the Protestants. The circumstances in the two cases were very unlike. So were the mythical systems that were discarded, and yet the issue was, in both instances, similar. Greek and Christian mythology have alike ended in pantheism. So soon as the constructions of the poets and the fathers were seen to be ingenuous fictions, criticism was confronted with an obvious duty to break up the mythical compound furnished by tradition into its elements, putting on one side what natural observation or actual history had supplied, and on the other what dramatic imagination had added. For a cool and disinterested observer, the task, where evidence and records were not wanting, would be simple enough. But the critic in this case would not usually be cool or disinterested. His religion was concerned. He had no other object to hang his faith and happiness upon than just this traditional hybrid, which his own enlightenment was now dissolving. To which part should he turn for support? In which quarter should he continue to place the object of his worship? From the age of the Sophists to the final disappearance of paganism, nearly 1,000 years elapsed. Religions do not disappear when they are discredited. It is requisite that they should be replaced. For 1,000 years, the augurs may have laughed. They were bound, nevertheless, to stand at their posts until the monks came to relieve them. During this prolonged decrepitude, paganism lived on inertia by accretions from the Orient and by philosophic reinterpretations. Of these reinterpretations, the first was that attempted by Plato, carried out by the Neoplatonists and Christians into the notion of a supernatural spiritual hierarchy above a dialectical deity, the hypostasis of intellect and its ontological phases. Below, a host of angels and demons, hypostases of faculties, moral influences, and evil promptings. In other words, in the diremption of myths, which yielded here a natural phenomenon to be explained, and there a moral value to be discerned, Platonism attached divinity exclusively to the moral element. The ideas, which were essentially moral functions, were many and eternal. Their physical embodiments were adventitious to them and constituted a lapse, a misfortune to be wiped out by an eventual reunion of the alienated nature with its own model. Religion, and such a system necessarily meant redemption. In this movement, paganism turned toward the future, toward supernatural and revealed religion, and away from its own naturalistic principle. Revelation, as Plato himself had said, was needed to guide a mind which distrusted phenomena and recoiled from earthly pursuits. This divorce of Neoplatonic ideas from the functions they originally represented in human life and discourse was found in the end to defeat the very interest that had prompted it. Enthusiasm for the ideal. Enthusiasm for the ideal had led Plato to treat all beauties as stepping stones toward a perfect beauty in which all their charms might be present together, eternally and without alloy. Enthusiasm for the ideal had persuaded him that mortal life was only an impeded effort to fall back into eternity. These inspired but strictly unthinkable suggestions fell from his lips in his zeal to express how much the burden and import of experience exceeded its sensuous vehicle in permanence and value. 1,000 triangles revealed one pregnant proportion of lines and areas. 1,000 beds and bridles served one perpetual purpose in human life, and found in fulfilling it their essence and standard of excellence. 1,000 fascinations taught the same lesson and coalesced into one reverent devotion to beauty and nobility, wherever they might bloom. It was accordingly a poignant sense for the excellence of real things that made Plato wish to transcend them. His metaphysics was nothing but a visionary intuition of values, an idealism in the proper sense of the word. But then the momentum of such enthusiasm remained without its motive power, and its transcendence without its inspiration in real experience. Idealism ceased to be an idealization, an interpretation of reality reaching prophetically to its goals. It became supernumerary, second physics, a world to which an existence was attributed, which could be hardly conceived and was certainly supported by no evidence, and, worst of all, it robbed the ideal of its ideality by tearing it up from its roots in natural will and inexperienced earthly benefits. For an ideal is not ideal if it is the ideal of nothing. Meantime, a second reinterpretation of mythology was attempted by the Stoics. Instead of moving forward, like Plato, toward the supernaturalism that was for so many ages to dominate the world, the Stoics, with greater loyalty to pagan principles, reverted to the natural forces that had been the chief basis for the traditional deities. The progress of philosophy had given the Stoics a notion of the cosmos, such as the early Aryan could not have possessed when he recorded and took to heart his scattered observations in the form of divine influences. To the Stoics, the world was evidently one dynamic system. The power that animated it was therefore one God. Accordingly, by turning them somewhat ruthlessly into moral apologues, they proceeded to identify Zeus with the order of nature. This identification was supported by many traditional tendencies and philosophic hints. The resulting concept, though still mythical, was perhaps as rationalistic as the state of science at the time could allow. Zeus had been from the beginning a natural force, at once serene and formidable, the thunderer no less than the spirit of the blue. He was the ruler of gods and men. He was, under limitations, a sort of general providence. Anaxagoras, too, in proclaiming the cosmic function of reason, had prepared the way for the Stoics in another direction. This reason, which in Socrates and Plato was already a deity, meant an order making for the good. It was the name for a principle, much like that which Aristotle called nature, an indwelling prophetic instinct by which things strive after their perfection and happiness. Now Aristotle observed this instinct, as behooved a disciple of Socrates. In specific cases, in which the good secured could be discriminated and visibly attained, there were many souls, each with its provident function, an immutable guiding ideal, one for each man and animal, one for each heavenly sphere, and one, the prime mover, for the highest sphere of all. But the Stoics, not trained in the same humane and critical school, had felt the unity of things more dramatically and vaguely in the realm of physics. Like Xenophanes of old, they gazed at the broad sky and exclaimed, "The all is one." Uniting these various influences, they found it easy to frame a conception of Zeus, or the world, or the universal justice and law, so as to combine in it a dynamic unity with a provident reason. A world conceived to be material and fatally determined was endowed with foresight of its own changes, perfect internal harmony, and absolute moral dignity. Thus, mythology, with the Stoics, ended in pantheism. On the other hand, mythology had not been a mere poetic physics. It had formulated the object of religion. It had embodied for mankind its highest ideals in worshipful forms. It was when this religious function was transferred to the god of pantheism that the paradox and impossibility of the reform became evident. Nature neither is nor can be man's ideal. The substitution of nature for the traditional and ideal object of religion involves giving nature moral authority over man. It involves that element of Stoicism which is the synonym of inhumanity. Life and death, good and ill fortune, happiness and misery, since they flow equally from the universal order, shall be declared, in spite of reason, to be equally good. True virtue shall be reduced to conformity. He who has no ideal, but that nature should possess her actual constitution, will be wise and superior to all flattery and calamity. He will be equal in dignity to Zeus. He who has any less conformable and more determinate interests will be a fool. The wise man will, meantime, perform all the offices of nature. He will lend his body and his mind to her predestined labors. For pantheistic morals, though post-rational, are not ascetic. In dislodging the natural ideal from the mind, they put in its place not its supernatural exaggeration, but a curtailment of it inspired by despair. The passions are not renounced on the ground that they impede salvation or some visionary ecstasy. They are merely chilled by the sense that their defeat, when it occurs, is also desirable. As all the gods have been reduced to one substance or law, so all human treasures are reduced to one privilege, that of fortitude. You can always consent, and by a forced and perpetual conformity to nature, lift yourself above all vicissitudes. Those tender and tentative ideals which nature really breeds, and which fill her with imperfect but genuine excellences, you will be too stolid to perceive or too proud to share. The horror which pantheism has always inspired in the Church is like that which materialism inspires in sentimental idealists. They attack it continually, not so much because anybody else defends it, as because they feel it to be implied unmistakably in half their own tenets. The non-Platonic half of Christian theology, the Mosaic half, is bound to become pantheism in the hands of a philosopher. The Jews were not pantheists themselves, because they never speculated on the relation which omnipotence stood in to natural forces and human acts. They conceived Jehovah's omnipotence dramatically, as they conceived everything. He might pounce upon anything and anybody. He might subvert or play with the laws of nature. He might laugh at men's devices and turn them to his own ends. His craft and energy could not but succeed in every instance. But that was not to say that men and nature had no will of their own. It did not proceed naturally on their respective ways when Jehovah happened to be busy elsewhere. So soon, however, as this dramatic sort of omnipotence was made systematic by dialectic, so soon as the doctrines of creation, omniscience, and providential government were taken absolutely, pantheism was clearly involved. The consequences to moral philosophy were truly appalling, for then the sins God punished so signally were due to his own contrivance. The fervors of the saints, the fate of his chosen people and holy temples became nothing but a puppet show in his ironical possession. The strangest part of the system in recent times is that it is only half conscious of its physical temper, and in calling itself an idealism, because it makes perception and will the substance of their objects, thinks itself an expression of human aspirations. This illusion has deep historical roots. It is the last stage of a mythical philosophy which has been earnestly criticizing its metaphors, on the assumption that they were not metaphorical, whereby it has stripped them of all significance and reduced them at last to the bare principles of inversion. Nothing is any longer idealized, yet all is still called an idealism. A myth is an inverted image of things, wherein their moral effects are turned into their dramatic antecedents, as when the wind's rudeness is turned into his anger. When the natural basis of moral life is not understood, myth is the only way of expressing it theoretically, as eyes too weak to see the sun face to face may, as Plato says, for a time study its image mirrored in pools, and, as we may add, inverted there. So the good, which in itself is spiritual only, is transposed into a natural power. At first, this amounts to an amiable misrepresentation of natural things. The gods inhabit Mount Olympus, and the Elysian fields are not far west of Cadiz. With the advantage of geography, the mythical facts recede, and in a cosmography like Hegel's, for instance, they have disappeared altogether. But there remain the mythical values once ascribed to those ideal objects, but now transferred and fettered to the sad realities that have appeared in their place. The titles of honor once bestowed on a fabled world are thus applied to the real world by right of inheritance. Nothing could be clearer than the grounds on which pious men in the beginning recognized divine agencies. We see, they say, the hand of God in our lives. He has saved us from dangers. He has comforted us in sorrow. He has blessed us with the treasures of life, of intelligence, of affection. He has set around us a beautiful world, and one still more beautiful within us. Pondering all these blessings, we are convinced that He is mighty in the world, and will know how to make all things good to those who trust Him. In other words, pious men discern God in the excellence of things. If all were well, as they hope it may some day be, God would henceforth be present in everything. While good is mixed with evil, He is active in the good alone. The pleasantness of life, the preciousness of human possessions, the beauty and promise of the world are proof of God's power. So is the stilling of tempests and the forgiveness of sins. But the sin itself and the tempest, which optimistic theology has to attribute just as much to God's purposes, are not attributed to Him at all by pious feelings, but rather to His enemies. in spite of centuries wasted in preaching God's omnipotence. His omnipotence is contradicted by every Christian judgment and every Christian prayer. If the most pious of nations is engaged in war and suffers a great accidental disaster, such as it might expect to be safe from, Te Deums are sung for those that were saved, and requiems for those that perished. God's office, in both cases, is to save only. The criterion of divine activity could not be placed more squarely and unequivocally in the good. Plato and Aristotle are not, in this respect, better moralists than is an unsophisticated piety. God is the ideal, and what manifests the ideal manifests God. The proof and measure of rationality in the world and of God's power over it is the extent of human satisfactions. The existence of any evil, and if evil is felt, it exists. For experience is its locus, is a proof that some accident has intruded into God's works. If that loyalty to the good, which is the prerequisite of rationality, is to remain standing, we must admit into the world, while it contains anything practically evil, a principle, however minimized, which is not rational. This irrational principle may be inertia in matter, accidental perversity in the will, or ultimate conflict of interest. Somehow, an element of resistance to the rational order must be introduced somewhere, and immediately, in order to distinguish the part furnished by reason from its irrational alloy, we must find some practical test. For if we are to show that there is a great and triumphant rationality in the world, in spite of irrational accidents and brute opposition, we must frame an idea of rationality different from that of being. It will no longer do to say, with the optimist, the rational is the real is the rational. For we wish to make a distinction in order to maintain our loyalty to the good, and not to eviscerate the idea of reason by emptying it of its essential meaning, which is action addressed to the good, and thought envisaging the ideal. To pious feeling, the free will of creatures, their power, active or passive, of independent origination, is the explanation of all defects, and everything which is not helpful to men's purposes must be assigned to their own irrationality as its cause. Herein lies the explanation of that paradox in religious feeling, which attributes sin to the free will, but repentance and every good work to divine grace. Physically considered, as theology must consider the matter, both acts and both volitions are equally necessary and involved in the universal order. But practical religion calls divine only what makes for the good, whence it follows at once that, both within and without us, what is done well is God's doing, and what is done ill is not. Thus, what we may call the practical or Hebrew theory of cosmic rationality betrays in the plainest possible manner that reason is primarily a function of human nature. Reason dwells in the world in so far as the world is good, and the world is good in so far as it supports the wills it generates, the excellence of each creature, the value of its life, and the satisfaction of its ultimate desires.